Every 30th person on this planet today lives in a country where they were not born, but there are countries that are not just exporters of people, they have become states in exile. And this is where we arrive at two stories that, at first glance, have nothing in common: Lebanon and Bosnia and Herzegovina. From the first step of man out of Africa more than 70,000 years ago to the migration crises filling headlines today, movement is the only constant of our species, but that constant has not always been free. It has not always been voluntary, and it has not always been humane. The story begins long before written history. The first people leave the African savannah and head into the unknown. They did not know where they were going. They had no maps or compasses. They had only the instinct for survival and a curiosity that would, it turns out, become our most powerful evolutionary trait. Over thousands of years, those first travellers populate the Middle East, Asia, Europe, and eventually the Americas and Australia. Every continent we know today, every civilization that ever flourished, it all began with a single step out of Africa. Then the first great civilizations rise up. And every single one of them rises along water. Rivers were the original highways of humanity. Along them moved merchants, soldiers, ideas, and religions. Every one of those movements reshapes the world it leaves behind and the world it enters. Then the empires arrive. Alexander the Great covers the distance from Greece to India in just over a decade. The Roman Empire at its peak stretches from Scotland all the way to Mesopotamia. Millions of people, soldiers, slaves, merchants, stay constantly in motion. Roman roads were built for one reason, so armies could move fast. But those same roads become the bloodstream of civilization, the veins through which culture, food, money and ideas flow across the known world. In the east, the Silk Road connects China to Europe across thousands of kilometers of deserts, mountains and steppes. And look, it was never one road. It was an entire network of routes carrying silk and spices, yes, but also religions, philosophies, and even pandemics. The plague that wiped out a third of Europe in the 14th century travelled precisely along those routes. Movement gives, and movement takes away. Then the Renaissance swings open the doors of European ships towards shores no European had ever seen. What they called the Age of Discovery was, for the people already living there, the beginning of the end. The colonisation of the Americas, the conquest of Africa. The consequences of those movements are still felt 500 years later, in languages, in borders, and in the economic inequalities that divide our world to this day. And then comes the darkest chapter in all of this: forced slave migration. Around 13 million Africans were violently taken to the Americas. They did travel, just not by choice. They were dragged. That crime is the literal foundation on which some of the wealthiest economies in the world today were built. The 19th century brings a new kind of mass movement. Millions of Irish flee famine. Millions of Italians, Germans and Poles cross the ocean looking for survival and a future in the new world. America becomes what it is, and a nation of immigrants, precisely during this era. And then, World War II delivers the greatest displacement in modern history. Between 40 and 65 million people uprooted across Europe alone. Entire nations moved, erased from maps, driven from homes their families built over generations. Today, the world carries roughly 280 million international migrants, 3.5% of the entire global population. And this is where those two stories finally come into focus: Lebanon and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Two small states, two complicated histories, two societies pulled apart by internal divisions and massive communities scattered all over the world. Both marked by wars that did not end in peace, only in exhaustion. And both living today inside a quiet and deeply paradoxical reality. The people who left are feeding the people who stayed. At first glance, these two countries look like they share absolutely nothing. One sits deep in the Balkans, wrapped in mountains, rivers and forests. The other faces the Mediterranean, its cities climbing up the Lebanese coast under a wide, bright sky. One speaks Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian. The other speaks Arabic and French. One was shaped by Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian hands. The other carved over centuries by Phoenicians, Romans, Ottomans and the French. And yet, the moment you look just beneath the surface, something strange happens. You start to feel like you're staring into a mirror. So let us start with what is beautiful, because there is plenty of that. Both of these countries sit at the crossroads of civilizations, and that is so much more than a geographic metaphor. Sarajevo is a city where a mosque, a church and a synagogue stand within a few hundred meters of each other. One of the rare places in Europe where different faiths genuinely shared the same space for centuries. There is a reason people called it the Jerusalem of Europe, and that was no accident. Beirut, on the other hand, was the Paris of the Middle East, a city that in the 50s and 60s stood as the cultural, financial and intellectual capital of the entire region, where Maronites and Druze, Sunnis and Shia, Armenian Christians and Greek Orthodox all lived side by side. A city that gave the Arab world some of its greatest literary figures, where Khalil Gibran wrote some of his most enduring lines. Both capitals carry that specific soul where food, hospitality and nightlife feel like almost a political act. But that exact beauty, that exact complexity becomes the heaviest burden both countries carry. Because that same crossroads of civilizations, that same blending of cultures and faiths, eventually got wired into political systems that locked both countries into a near permanent state of crisis. In Lebanon, power has been divided along religious lines since the period of the French Mandate and independence in 1943. The president stays a Maronite Christian, the prime minister stays a Sunni Muslim, the Speaker of Parliament stays a Shia Muslim. This arrangement is called the National Pact, an unwritten agreement designed to guarantee equality and stability. That same system, slightly adjusted, was confirmed by the Teeth Agreement of 1989, which formally closed the books on a 15-year civil war. Bosnia and Herzegovina carries a different history but arrives at a remarkably similar place. The Dayton Peace Agreement of 1995 ended a war that lasted nearly 4 years and left behind a political structure divided along ethno-national lines. 3 presidents, Bosniak, Serbian and Croatian, 2 entities, and practically no government is possible without all 3 sides finding agreement. Both Dayton and Taif brought peace. Both were necessary, and both at the same time froze divisions that were supposed to be temporary but quietly became permanent. There is an irony in that, and it is almost literary. The agreements that stopped the wars ended up institutionalizing the very logic those wars ran on.
The main problem is the return of refugees and displaced persons. There, in fact, we have a minus balance. That means that less people are now in their home than at the time of the signature of the Dayton Agreement. This is worrying. This is something.
And it was. Bosnia and Herzegovina is, by its constitution, a secular state. Lebanon technically is not, but when you factor in that 97% of the population in Bosnia identifies as monotheistic believers in the last census, it becomes clear that religion shapes everyday life and politics regardless of what any law says. In practice, both states run on nearly identical logic. Your faith, your ethnicity, determines your ceiling. Outside the 3 dominant groups in Bosnia, the doors to high state functions stay closed. Outside the Maronite, Sunni or Shia community in Lebanon, the same story plays out. And when a system grinds to a halt for years, when your ethnicity determines your ceiling, when politicians block each other for decades while the country stands completely still, the young do something very specific. They pack their bags, and they have been doing it for decades. That is, honestly, the deepest consequence of everything built into these systems. Lebanon is a category entirely of its own. Estimates place the population inside the country between 4.6 and 6 million people. The diaspora sits somewhere between 10 and 15 million. In Brazil alone, 7 million people of Lebanese origin live today. Argentina holds around 3 million more. Bosnia and Herzegovina currently holds between 3 and 3.3 million people within its borders. Between 2 and 2.5 million Bosnians live outside those borders. Basically, every other Bosnian lives somewhere else. Some estimates, counting all generations of descendants, push the diaspora figure toward 4 million, placing Bosnia immediately behind Guyana as the country with the highest share of its own people living outside its borders anywhere on Earth. And if you're wondering why Lebanon does not appear on that list, the answer is straightforward. The last relevant census in Lebanon was conducted nearly 100 years ago in 1932. And the trend shows zero signs of slowing. In Bosnia, tens of thousands leave every single year, mostly young, mostly educated. The average age of the population in Bosnia and Herzegovina today sits at 46 years, one of the highest in Europe, a direct consequence of that outflow. There is one detail that illustrates, maybe better than anything else, how deeply the diaspora has become part of the identity of these countries. Bosnia and Herzegovina qualified for the 2026 FIFA World Cup, the second time in history. And when you look at the squad, you notice something. A significant number of those players were born or grew up in the diaspora, in Austria, Switzerland, Germany, the United States, connected to Bosnia only through their parents' roots. In the Austrian government, a Bosnian woman served as Minister of Justice. Alma Zardic fled Tuzla as a 10-year-old refugee in 1994 and became the first minister in Austrian history with a migration background. In the German Bundestag, Bosnians sit as members of parliament. In the United States, the Bosnian community stands as one of the most active diaspora communities shaping American civic life. And the Lebanese diaspora, that is a story of its own. Possibly one of the greatest examples in modern history of how far a small nation can leave its mark beyond its own borders. The richest man in Mexico, Carlos Slim Helú, is of Lebanese origin. The president of the Dominican Republic, Luis Abinader, is of Lebanese origin. The president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, is of Lebanese origin. Shakira is not a stage name. Her real surname is Mebarak. Salma Hayek too. Around 10% of members of the Brazilian Congress are descendants of Lebanese emigrants. Those who left are feeding those who stayed. We already said that, but let us take a look at whether that is actually true and what those words mean in numbers. According to data from the Central Bank of Bosnia and Herzegovina, in 2024 remittances from abroad totaled around 2.1 billion euros, money that was not earned in Bosnia, but that is keeping Bosnia on its feet. To put that into a context that perhaps speaks louder than the numbers themselves, the consolidated budget of Bosnia and Herzegovina for 2024 stood at around 10.9 billion euros. The diaspora sent back 2.1 billion euros in the same year through official channels alone. Economists estimate that another 30 to 40% should be added for the cash people bring with them when they come home, which means the real number is likely closer to 3 billion euros annually. And in Lebanon, the picture is even more striking. In 2023, Lebanon received $6.7 billion in remittances, which represented 30.7% of its total GDP, the third highest ratio in the entire world. That money accounts for more than 80% of all external financial flows into the country, more than foreign direct investment and international development aid combined. At the beginning, we said that movement is the only constant of our species, that all of us, at some point in history, have been on the road. Bosnians and Lebanese know that better than most. But perhaps the biggest mistake in the way we talk about migration is that we always see it as a loss, as a wound, as something that happened to a country, rather than something a people decided or were forced to do. Every departure is counted, every shrinking census is mourned. But rarely do we talk about what those same people are doing wherever they ended up. And they build. They lead countries, fill stadiums, send money home, preserve the language, cook the same food, pass down the same stories to their children on the other side of the world. An identity that could not breathe freely in a small country found its space somewhere else.